talks about a new kind of warfare. Airplanes were used. The airplanes of those days were made of wood. The aluminum airplane had not yet been invented. They were generally made of balsa wood, a lightweight wood. And they often were biplanes, and they had for wings, they had canvas. Now some of them were triplanes. Now maybe some of you as kids might have seen the put together models of biplanes and triplanes. The triplane had the advantage as 3 wings were shorter than the biplanes, and that meant it could maneuver faster. And a lot of the pilots liked to fly them because they could turn a lot sharper than the biplane could. I flew in a biplane one time over Key West. It was one of the noisiest airplane rides I've ever had. But yeah, my wife and I, on our honeymoon, flew in a biplane. They still make, every once in a while you look up and you'll see a plane, you'll know correctly because they have 2 wings, one on top of the other. No, they're not as old as 1917 now. They're not that old, but there's still some of them still in service. Anyway, at first, planes were used for just reconnaissance. They would go out, look over the territory, and then come back and report what they'd seen. But then one day, a pilot carried a pistol with him. When he saw an enemy plane, he started firing the pistol. The idea caught on quickly. They began to put machine guns on their plane, but the problem was the machine gun could shoot the propeller off. So they learned how to time, and this is amazing, they do this as long ago as 1918, but to learn how to time the propeller to where the prop would not be where the bullet was coming out of the gun, and where the gun would wait. I mean, I know all this is going at really, really fast pace, but the gun would wait to fire until the propeller blade got past them. Then it would fire, and machine guns were carried. And oftentimes these pilots would have 2 machine guns side by side, and the props were always in front. They only had single engine planes in those days. The 2-engine plane, as far as I know, had not yet been invented. And this made flying extremely dangerous, but it also led to some heroes, the most famous being Captain Eddie Rickenback. There were some others who got famous as men who could shoot down enemy aircraft while flying. The Germans used big balloons to drop bombs on the British. But then the British learned that if they hit these balloons with a certain kind of bullet, the balloons would blow up into, they were filled with hydrogen, they'd blow up into big flames that would destroy everything on board. So the balloons were ineffective, but this was the beginning of bomb warfare that was to be a big part of World War II. Now, what finally broke the trench stalemate was the invention of the tank. They had got to name tank because when the British were developing it, they knew that there were a lot of German spies living in Britain. And a lot of their own people were spies for the Germans, so they gave it an innocent tank. In fact, the first tank was called Mother. Just to get the Germans, they gave it a very inconspicuous name that they figured would not create a lot of attention to itself. Then they put these tanks on a battlefield, and oh yeah, the tanks were track vehicles. And if you know anything about track, I mean, when I was a kid, I used to wonder, how can a track vehicle turn? But then I learned some basic physics. A track vehicle turns when one of the tracks is moving faster than the other. And when I was in the Guard, I was in a tank outfit, and I had the privilege to drive a tank. Tanks are driven with a stick, not a steering wheel. And if you wanted to move left, you just move the stick to the left, and that will speed up the track on the right. It might slow down the track on the left. Basically, you can actually turn a tank on a dime just by reversing the one track. Well, if the one track going one way and the other track going another, the tank will turn on itself, turn on a dime, and turn faster. You can never turn an automobile or a truck. But anyway, the tank was invented. At first, they were not very effective, but by the end of the war, they had a tank, the British did, that could withstand machine gun fire and even some heavy artillery fire. And it could move big guns into the battlefield. And it did a lot to drive the Germans back. The tank proved to be a big, important weapon in World War II. Now, fast forward to modern times, I've told you it's a tank outfit, but we talked about it when I was in the National Guard. A tank is the worst place to be in a modern battlefield. There are more anti-tank weapons than we feel comfortable with. and every one of them can destroy everybody in a tank at once. Even though today's tanks are compartmentalized, supposedly if a hole is knocked in one part of the tank, the rest of them will survive. Well, today's weapons are so bad, they'll knock out everybody in the tank all at once. And again, no protection, no defense, because the heat from the tank actually serves to attract the incoming missile, and it helps to destroy it. Your book switches from military to civilian life. Total war, how that the people of Europe began to hate the war as time went on. At first they had enthusiasm for the war. So all the governments of Europe resorted to confiscating eliminating basic civil liberties. They eliminated freedom of the press. They jailed dissenters. And even, folk, this was done in the United States. The United States jailed persons who protested the war effort. Newspapers were controlled, and some newspapers were told to shut down until the war was over. Freedom of speech was curtailed. Saying anything against the president or against the government could get you a fine or a time in jail, or both. Basic civil liberties were wiped out. We had done the same thing, by the way, during the Civil War, both the Union and Confederate. President Abraham Lincoln suspended civil liberties during the Civil War. Folks, it's war. But again, the governments resorted to propaganda. Now, this was to have a really bad effect later. But here's what the British government did. They talked about how terrible the Germans treated the people of Belgium when they moved into Belgium. The stories were pure propaganda. They were exaggerated. They were largely untrue. And eventually it was found out that, hey, not everything that the British accused the Germans of doing, the Germans were guilty of. All right, fast forward to World War II. In World War II, stories got out that the Nazis were imprisoning people and putting them in the gas chamber to throw them alive in the ovens. And the British press refused to publish it. They said, this is stretched, exaggerated, it's pure propaganda. We can't publish this. The problem was in World War II, it was every bit the truth. In World War I, it was exaggerated. Folks, sometimes people will become what you make them out to be. In American history, Benedict Arnold was called a traitor before he finally became one. If you call a person something long enough, he might become what you call him. In the case of the Germans, the British called them abusers. By World War II, they had become that. You call somebody something long enough, he's likely or possibly will become the thing you call him. The book talks about women, how that women were forced to work in the factories because all the able-bodied men were in the army. So women began driving the trucks, doing things that men had done before, operating factory machinery. In some cases, that women knew that they were just being put there temporarily, and also because there was a war on, the wages were deliberately kept low. So the women worked for low pay, but in some cases the women benefited, particularly when it was shown that women could do the certain work that the men had done before. The most obvious gain, your book says, was women were given the right to vote. Germany and Austria gave them the right to vote immediately after the war. Britain had given their women the right to vote before the war ended. And the United States turned around and gave its women the right to vote shortly after the war ended. The war ended in 1918. Women were given the right to vote in 1919. And women first voted in the United States in the 1920 election. So women, in the long run, perhaps benefited, but in the short run, they knew that their jobs would be taken from them once the war was over, and all these millions of men returned from the war, and they would have to relinquish their jobs. All right, now, I once talked to one of my department heads who said that he gets to a part of the story where I've got 10 minutes left in the story I'm going to tell. It's going to take longer than that, but I'm going to start it anyway. The Russian Revolution. To make a really long story short, in 1917, the communists moved in and took over Russia. That's what this whole thing is talking about. Then we go into more detail now. What happened? Why did it happen? Well, essentially, it happened because the war was going really, really badly for Russia. And Russian economy was in shambles. The Russian war effort was in complete state of disarray also. And the government was being run by a man who really was not. That name is sometimes spelled T-S-A-R and sometimes C-Z-A-R. Nicholas II, seeming he was a good man morally. There are persons who have said if he had been the second son of his father and only served a supporting role, and there had been an older brother who is more capable, the whole story might have had a different ending. As it was, he was more suited for court life than he was suited for being the head of the government. There also have been stories going around that the Romanov dynasty had a bad gene going down through the generations that had affected, in fact, it's been suggested, we can't prove it, that Peter the Great himself was criminally insane. And one of his grandchildren, Paul II, was also criminally insane. And this bad gene ran down the line and affected them. What is known for sure is that these czars and these royals, people in Europe, were inbred. The royalty tended to marry other royalty, and they thought that, hey, the royalty is the good genes, the better genes. But what they didn't realize is by keeping the genes in the same gene pool, all the bad genes were going to stay in the pool. And what they should have done was married outside their gene pool. In other words, basically married non-royals. I mean, some of them, when I talk about the gene pool business, might not seem to have understood, but I do want to put them on the subject. I want to point out a picture to you on page 683 that shows 4 men. Which one of them is bigger than the other 3? I mean, hey, these men are heads of state now. I mean, it's not just a coincidence, I don't think. One of these men stands head and shoulders above the other 3.
That'd be Woodrow Wilson?
Woodrow Wilson. He's the American. When the United States got involved in the war in 1918, went over there, everybody noticed the American was bigger than his European counterpart. Was it due to better diet? I do not think so. I think it was due to the fact that American men and women tended to marry strangers, tended to marry people whom our kith and kin had never heard of. Basically, we married people way over the horizon. Or if Germans would marry French, and Scots people would marry Italians, and Austrians would marry Finns or Polish people, and this led to the bad genes being, usually bad genes are recessive, the bad genes being more or less bred out of the gene pool, and the American became bigger and stronger and perhaps healthier and even smarter than his European counterpart. But anyway, back to this, the czars were inbred. That is, their parents were not brother and sister, but they might as well have been because they were related. On the father's side, they were related. On the mother's side, they were related. And that meant that Tsar Nicholas had problems with his mind and body. Now, the Tsar had a son, don't worry about his name, named Alexis, but his son was hemophiliac. That meant every time he got hurt, they had a difficult time stopping the bleeding. Well, into this scenario stepped a man named Rasputin, knew how to stop the bleeding. Well, the Tsar's wife, the Tsarina, began to believe that, hey, this man is somewhat of a prophet or somewhat of a god. Now, by any chance, did any of you watch a movie that came out about 18 years ago called Anastasia? Oh, a bunch of hands going up. Yes. Well, when my wife took my children to watch it, she came home and asked me, did such a man as Rasputin exist? Well, yeah, I told you, definitely did. Now, I want to say this about Rasputin, folks. He had a problem with body odor. He was very dirty. He was a member of a religious cult that practiced sex orgies. He was looked on, though, as being something of a prophet by the Tsar's wife, something of way more than a man, some man who had a direct contact with heaven. There have been persons who have said that he was sent by the communists to undermine the Tsar, and that he was given a secret of stopping bleeding, which would make the Tsar's wife think highly of him. The Tsar's wife wound up putting so much confidence in him, she wound up revealing some deeply held family secrets to him, which put him in a position of awesome authority. He was giving some very bad advice to the Tsar. And everybody in the Kremlin said to themselves, hey, if the government is to survive, if the royal family survive, if the country survive, we've got to get rid of this Rasputin. No. There have even been persons who have said that Rasputin was sent to Russia by the Vatican in hopes of destroying the Russia, because Russia was Eastern Orthodox Church and the Vatican wanted them to become Roman Catholic again. Folk, you can believe what you want to. Now, this is something now I'm about to say that I always say to every class, and you can decide for yourself what you think about it. Remember, we're all adults now. There have been persons who have said that they believe that Rasputin was demon-possessed. Demon possession made big news some 30 years ago with a movie called Rosemary's Baby. Again, you can handle that any way you want to. Whatever you want to believe, you can believe. Whatever, he was in charge and he was making the decisions for the Tsar and ruining the Tsar's family. He was finally killed. When I was in high school, they had an article in the Reader's Digest by a man who said, I killed Rasputin. Today it's generally disputed, but they said Rasputin, you've read the article?
It took like 5 people to kill him.
It took what?
It took 5 people.
It took 5 people to kill him, yeah, and he wouldn't die. Basically, he went berserk at one point. They shot him. He wouldn't kill him. It took 2 hours to bring him down. This according to the article. But again, the story cannot be confirmed. Whatever. It seemed like they had a hard time finishing him off, but finally, they finished him off, but too late to save the Tsar.